From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Welcome back, Rendezvous with History listeners. I'm your host, Anthony Eames, and I'm pleased to be joined here today with Adam Higginbotham, the New York Times bestselling author of Midnight in Chernobyl, and, for our purposes, the author of a new book coming out in just a couple of weeks, Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space. Surely it'll be another New York Times bestseller. Adam, good to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Adam, what we do here with pretty much every episode is ask, why did you want to write this book?
Okay. I mean, I've always been fascinated with the space program since I was a kid. And I think I was 12 when the first shuttle launch took place in 1981. So this is kind of, the shuttle was sort of my part of the space program. And I first it was first brought back into my mind by the fact that when I was promoting the Chernobyl book, I was often asked if I remembered exactly where I was when I heard about the Chernobyl explosion. And I had to admit that I had no idea. I couldn't remember anything about it at all. But Challenger, which happened almost exactly 3 months before that, I had vivid memories of exactly where I was when I found out about it, exactly how I felt, exactly how shocked I was to hear about it. And so then when I started to think about ideas for another book, this was kind of at the top of my mind. And when I began looking into it, I realized that there had been no serious attempt to write a sort of a comprehensive narrative about what happened since 1987. And in the intervening years, an enormous amount of material and personal testimony had come forward. And not only that, but at the other end, the people who were there and had witnessed it were getting old and were dying. So I thought, much as I did, to be honest, with the Chernobyl book, that there was an opportunity here to write about this in detail in an accessible and hopefully interesting way, before it was consigned completely to history, while the eyewitnesses were still around. And more than that, I wanted to write a sort of new version of the story, because previous accounts had concentrated they were either kind of academic or technical accounts of what happened that concentrated on very specific areas of the accident, or they told the story of Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, because that was the aspect of the accident that most people who were around at the time were familiar with. But nobody had really tried to tell the story of the 7 astronauts on the crew, and the 6 other members of the crew all had these extraordinary stories of what brought them to the launch pad that day. I mean, not least because it was probably the most diverse crew in NASA history at that point. There were 2 women and 5 men, the second African American in space. Rod McNair was on the crew. Judy Resnick, the second woman in space. Ellis Onizuka, the first Asian American in space. And all of these guys had these kind of fascinating stories, and the path that brought them to become astronauts in the first place. There was also the aspect of the story that, there was this group of rocket engineers from Morton Thiokol, contractors who built the solid rocket boosters that were the immediate cause of the accident. And there was this opportunity to tell their story from the inside that hadn't been there before. And then finally, there was the decision-making at Thiokol and at NASA, which there was also a wealth of material to draw on. And then the Rogers Commission investigation, which I discovered to my great surprise while I was actually working on the manuscript. I thought, oh, well, somebody must have done a huge kind of newspaper series on inside the Rogers Commission investigation. In like 1988, somebody would have done an anniversary, but there wasn't. And so I had to do that from scratch, which I was pretty surprised by when I was in the middle of the research.
All right, so like a lot of books, this ended up being more work than you actually thought it would be, but probably more rewarding in the end run. And just so I have this clear, if I do my back of the napkin calculations correct, 1981 shuttle program was what caught your eye. So that means you're born the same year as the first moon landing.
No, I was born in 1968. I was 13 months old, the first moon landing.
Okay.
And my mother did tell me that they woke me up, because it was in England, it was the middle of the night. They woke me up when I was 13 months old to witness the TV broadcast of them landing on the moon. Although sadly, obviously, I have no memory of that.
And yet you could say your attention has been on space ever since. Okay, so let's get into the early part of the book, because you point out that you want to tell the stories of those astronauts whose stories haven't been told, of the manufacturers whose stories haven't been told. And you do that by bringing us kind of all the way back to the early years of NASA. One of the things you seem to point out in the context of discussion of the Apollo 1 catastrophe or the X-15 accident is that there's a kind of a compromise on safety standards, a compromise on cost and budgets that becomes somewhat baked into NASA, but there's no compromise on vision. Is that how you saw the early years of NASA leading up to the Challenger disaster?
Well, I mean, I guess I agree with two of those things. But I think one of the central issues at the heart of the story is the idea of acceptable risk, right? Which is that anyone flying as a test pilot or flying into space, accepts that what you're doing is an extremely dangerous endeavor. And you have to figure out so it's never going to be completely safe. That's the thing, is that there's a couple of individuals in the book who remark at one time or another that, you could make spaceflight completely safe, but the only way of doing that is never to leave the ground. Right. And so you've just got to decide on a sort of sliding scale what level of risk is acceptable in this enterprise that is always going to be extremely dangerous. And part of the story of the Challenger program is how that level of acceptable risk was gradually and sort of unconsciously expanded over the years. And one of the reasons that was eventually compromised was because of these budgetary restrictions that you refer to. So the Apollo program, which was also exceedingly dangerous, was never in danger of being underfunded because of the way the whole notion of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s was effectively sort of sanctified by the fact that it had been originated by Kennedy, who was then assassinated. And so this became a goal that everybody was really fundamentally committed to, not least because of its importance in the Cold War. And that meant that nobody was ever going to question whether or not you should commit more money to it. But by the time the space shuttle program rolled around, the country was in a very different economic situation. Nixon, who was responsible for overseeing approval or disapproval of the project when it was first originated, had no interest in space at all. And so what happened was, under those circumstances, they originated a budget request for what they estimated would be, I think, around $14 billion. And Nixon's Office of Management and Budget gave them $5.5 billion. This is at the very outset of the program. Now, NASA knew that there was absolutely no way they could build this thing and send it into space successfully with less than half the money they asked for. So compromise was was at the heart of the program from the very beginning, and that was one of the sorts of original sins of the space shuttle program, was they were trying to do too much with too little, which sort of brings me to your third point, which is, there was no compromise in vision. And this is another of the I think sort of overarching sort of sub themes of the book, really, is that part of the problem that the success of the moon program bequeathed NASA was that very early on, the agency became convinced that in order to guarantee their own future and the future of their specific programs, they needed an enormous amount of public engagement. And what that they imagined brought with it was congressional commitment, congressional approval, and the money. And they constantly feared from the very beginning that if they weren't doing things that were so exciting and groundbreaking, dynamic and risk-taking, then they would lose public attention. And this is exactly what happened with the Apollo program, is that once, Armstrong and Aldrin had come back to Earth and been celebrated in ticker tape parades around the globe, public engagement with the moon program gradually began to slide, to the point where by the time the Apollo 17 astronauts were walking on the moon, people phoned into TV stations to complain that soap operas had been cancelled as a result of NASA insisting on screening footage of men walking on the moon, which now, in hindsight, seems unbelievable. But that's how quickly the public became jaded with these astonishing feats. And so NASA was constantly chasing this level of public engagement, and that's really part of the tragedy, because one of the people I interviewed for the book, he sadly died very soon after I spoke to him, was Robert Frosch, who was the administrator of NASA, the chief of NASA, during the most crucial years of the shuttle program, when they essentially had to make the decision of whether to recommit to it and make it happen or just cancel it completely. And he said to me that this was just a total delusion, that the idea that without public engagement with what they were doing, NASA would be all over and their manned programs would be brought to an end. He said that was just nonsense, because the military importance of what they were doing in space was so important that Congress is always going to keep signing the checks. And so he thought this was just a complete canard, and that NASA's always been chasing this, this chimera, really.
It's interesting because NASA remains committed to this idea of public engagement today.
Yes.
Although it seems that a lot of the issue of public engagement has to do with workforce. And are we recruiting the best people into the NASA mission? You actually get into this really in an interesting way in the kind of late 60s and 70s, when you're looking at the kind of social and cultural change of the United States, civil rights movement, women's rights movement, and how that starts to kind of filter into NASA's thinking about selection of astronauts, all while the Soviet Union seems to get the march on them in putting the first woman in space. Can you tell me a little bit about, because this is so important for the Challenger story, as you pointed out, the most diverse crew in the history of NASA. Tell me a little bit about how the lead up to that crew selection for Challenger really goes all the way back to the 60s and 70s and some of those key changes in astronaut selection.
Well, I think we should be clear that really, NASA diversified their astronaut intake at first largely because they had to, because equal opportunity legislation came into effect the federal government in the early 70s. So although there were plenty of people at senior levels within NASA who were behind the idea of diversifying the astronaut corps, I'm not sure how quickly it would have happened had that legislation not come into force. But what you're talking about is the fact that in the 50s and 60s, the astronaut corps was composed entirely of good, upstanding, church-going white men, none of whom were too tall, because the initial space capsules were so compact that there was actually a height limit on astronauts. And there was a lot of pressure from women who wanted to join the astronaut corps, and from actually within the Kennedy administration to introduce black astronaut candidates to the astronaut corps. But NASA continually defaulted to this position where they required that anyone who would come forward to be considered as an astronaut candidate had to have thousands of hours of high performance jet flight under their belt before they'd even think about them. So this was a kind of convenient way of excluding women, certainly, because women couldn't serve in the armed forces. So the only people who could get close to this were a handful of women who had served as test pilots, or people who were wealthy enough to have their own experience of flying in jet planes. And similarly, the structural forces at work within the armed forces that prevented black members of the Air Force from qualifying as fighter pilots, had the same effect. So there's only a handful of black pilots who could get close to that kind of qualification, and none of them was ever selected. Not until I think 1968 was Robert Lawrence eventually selected for astronaut training, and that was by the back door, because at that point the Air Force had its own military astronaut training program.
And so this you do make a kind of important point of pointing out how some of the old guard exits on this issue. It strikes me that there's a point in your book where you talk about Deke Slayton, who's been somewhat lionized in some recent popular culture, popular media. If you look at the show For All Mankind, he has this conversion to welcoming all sorts of different astronauts into
he
the
does?
fold.
I haven't seen that.
Specifically, I think a gay astronaut, he becomes a welcoming into the fold of NASA.
Oh, that's excellent writing, but obviously fictional.
You have an episode in this book which suggests the exact opposite, that this really kind of ruffles the feathers of the old guard at NASA, this change.
I mean, Deke Slayton was certainly not on board with it, because they had an initial meeting to discuss diversification of the astronaut corps, and explained that they were going to open up the kind of field of types of astronauts they recruited to include this new category of mission specialist, which would specifically be non-pilot astronauts, because even when they had begun to open up astronaut candidacy at the end of the 60s to include scientist astronauts, so they could get more, geologists, for instance, specialists who could, in this instance, go to the moon and really know what they were talking about, who are not, pilots who were trained in these things on the side, but people who specialized in it. Even then, when they had this intake of these sort of, eggheads and academics, in the late 60s, they insisted that one of the first things those guys did was train to be high-performance jet pilots. And so what happened when they had this intake of what became Astronaut Group 8, which was the first astronaut group that would be trained specifically to fly aboard the shuttle, they made this category of mission specialists for whom flying was not going to be necessary. They could be backseaters in T-38s, the training aircraft that NASA used and allowed the astronauts to use as kind of runabouts to crisscross the country. They'd fly in the back. They would understand how to communicate. They'd understand the escape procedures, and they could take the stick to kind of fool around, but they wouldn't need to qualify as pilots.
Well, I bring all this up because what it points to is at the start of the 1980s, your book lays out an important theme that it really seems that America is on the cusp of its second space age. There's two parts to that agenda. You have Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, which actually an earlier episode of our podcast, kind of did a deep dive into. And then we have the commercial civilian aspect of spacefaring, the shuttle program. And as you say, this kind of marks an almost perfect uh, relationship between Reagan's Morning Again in America rhetoric and this second space age. How do you see those two things come together?
Well, I think that it was a very sort of adroitly choreographed part of Reagan's approach to the way that he talked about the space program and stood behind it, because and it was kind of, it worked out very conveniently for him, because as I said, Robert Frosch, who was the administrator under Carter, and Carter himself were essentially the people who saved the shuttle program from extinction, really before it had even got started. They were the people that put the money in to save it and brought it to the launch pad. And under the original plans, Carter would have been the president who oversaw the first space shuttle launch. And it just got put back and put back and put back. Originally, I think it was scheduled for 79, and then it slipped to 80. And so,
Right.
They have this, Carter and Frosch have this meeting where they're discussing, what Carter's going to be doing during the first space shuttle launch. And then, of course, he gets chased out of office. Reagan comes in. So then the successful launch of the first space shuttle, Columbia, in 1981, Reagan gets to totally claim as his own. And he characterizes this rather brilliantly, as he returns to the concept of the high frontier. It's the pioneer spirit thrives in America. So he ties it directly to this, notion of the Old West. It's perfect for Reagan. And there are ways in which, when you read back on the contemporary coverage of it, it's so on the nose that it ties perfectly into this notion of Morning in America. Because just 12 months earlier, the space shuttle program was regarded as this kind of endlessly delayed carousel of technological snafus, it was becoming a national embarrassment. It was over budget, it was over schedule, it was going to be a disaster. The Washington Post was writing these editorials where they called it the aluminum Dumbo, that it should not ever fly. It was a complete disaster. And then with the launch of this thing in April 1981 was so successful and went over so well with the public, massive features in National Geographic. There's a great story that the New York Times ran on, like page 5, the morning after the launch, where the reporter sees a bellhop in the foyer of the Hilton on Fifth Avenue or something, just shouting, "We're number one again," and that's really how people felt. I mean, when and one of the the terrible things about the Challenger story is that disaster has kind of overshadowed the story of how technologically ahead of its time, how fantastically successful the program was, and how good it made people feel at the time. When I went back and looked at those reports from 81, a crowd of 250,000 people turned out into the high desert in California to watch Columbia land in the desert in the middle of nowhere. That's a lot of people. And that level of re-engagement with NASA and the space program, and the way in which the shuttle itself just became emblematic of America getting back on its feet after Watergate, after Vietnam, after the economic travails of the 70s. That kind of, as you say, tied perfectly into the way Reagan represented his vision of a new America.
I love how you put this, but then the careful read of this program, as you've done, there's always something under the hood, right? There's always something that isn't as it should be, and you do a good job talking about the excitement, the success of that Columbia launch and landing. And then we get into O-rings, which feels like we're back in the 1980s, because O-rings were everywhere. What's interesting about your book and your discussion of this O-ring, which you're going to have to explain to our listeners, right?
Okay.
It brings up a different question of, how do we know something is new? And how do we know something is just a kind of an iteration or a second generation product of an original design. What is new under the sun, technologically speaking? So get to that question, but first tell us why O-rings are significant in this whole story.
Okay, well, they're significant because the O-ring is the proximate cause of the Challenger disaster. Now, the O-rings are a tiny but very significant part of the solid rocket boosters. The solid rocket boosters were actually another aspect of the compromises that we talked about earlier, because the compromises in the shuttle caused, to a large extent, by these kind of budgetary shortfalls, were things that led indirectly to the disaster. Now, the way in which the shuttle reached space was driven, by the most part, by the solid rockets, which provided the majority of the thrust. These two strap-on rockets, which in principle are little different from giant fireworks. They're not like these very sophisticated liquid-fueled rockets that fueled the Saturn V rockets that took people to the moon. And one of the most significant aspects in which they're different from liquid-fueled rockets is that liquid-fueled rockets can be treated like a kind of car engine. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, you can throttle it up and down. You can shut it down, and then a few minutes later you can fire it up again if you want to. But with solid rockets, they light on the launch pad, and they're filled with hundreds of thousands of pounds of extremely volatile solid fuel. And you light them up on the launch pad, and then they're going to burn for 2 minutes. They cannot be throttled down. They cannot be turned off. They cannot be turned on again. And so once that happens, you're committed to just around 2 minutes of flight on the solid rockets. And this was one of the reasons why the original designers of the shuttle didn't like the idea. And actually, Wernher von Braun, who was the mastermind behind the Apollo program, believed that solid rockets were too dangerous to ever be used for manned spaceflight, and was dead against using them. But largely for budgetary reasons, they ended up committing to using the solid rockets. And the other budgetary restriction that had a significant bearing on the program was that the space shuttle was the first manned vehicle in NASA history that did not have a mode of escape for the astronauts during ascent. And these two things, the commitment to solid rockets and the failure to accommodate an means of escape for those first 2 minutes of flight, meant that NASA took the approach that the means of ensuring the safety of the astronauts during ascent to space was simple. The solid rockets could not fail. They had to be 100% assured of success, because, as somebody put it in a subsequent magazine article before the first shuttle launch, they said, what happens if something goes wrong with the solid rockets? Here's the plan. The plan is you die. And as it turned out, although because they were essentially like giant Roman candles, they were regarded both by the astronauts and many of the engineers who worked in the program as among the simplest and the safest parts of an otherwise very demandingly complex system, they began to discover that there were problems with the design of these rockets as the launch date approached. And one of the problems was rooted in the fact that the rockets were made in segments instead of being cast in one, because they're absolutely enormous. They couldn't cast them as a single piece, so they had to build them in segments. These segments were then shipped across the country from the plant in Utah and then put together in the vehicle assembly building at the Cape. Now, in order to make sure these segments sealed successfully, they were fitted together very tightly. They had holes drilled all the way around the circumference of the rocket. 177 steel pins went into these holes to secure the segments together. And to make sure that the seal between the segments was as tight as possible, they had a pair of O-rings that were, again, in principle, a massive oversimplification, not different from the O-rings that you would find in a faucet in a kitchen sink, or the O-rings in a carburetor in a car engine. And these O-rings were supposed to guarantee the safety of the seal. So there was a primary, and there was a second one to provide a backup, redundancy, in case the first one leaked. Now, over the course of the shuttle program, indeed, from the second shuttle flight on, they had begun to find that jets of hot gas from inside the rockets as they were burning, and particularly when they were first lit on the launch pad, could begin to kind of drill holes in these O-rings that were only a quarter of an inch thick. And so they feared that this was going to compromise the safety of the seal. And what happened with solid rockets is, one of the engineers who worked on them said to me, everybody knows that solid rockets don't, if they spring a leak, they don't just kind of, go off course a little bit. They explode, because what happens is you'll get this tiny jet of hot gas burning at between 5,000 and 6,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Will very quickly drill a hole in the first ring, then the second ring, and then it's out to the casing, and it will just cut a hole in the casing of the rocket was half an inch thick, but it would just go through that like a blowtorch. And if that happens, then the whole shuttle stack will come apart. It could drill a hole, then cut a hole in the external tank, which sat beneath the space shuttle orbiter itself and between the two solid rockets, and provided fuel for the space shuttle's main engines. And that was full at launch of 500,000 gallons of highly pressurized liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. And so if this jet could escape from one of the solid rocket booster's joints, it would cut a hole in the tank and light that off, and then you just have a massive fireball.
So the Rogers Commission dives into this, and you mentioned earlier in our interview, in our conversation, that no one's really done a deep dive on the Rogers Commission since the Rogers Commission laid out its findings. What are the surprising things that you find are noteworthy, worth inclusion in this book from that commission's investigation?
Well, I think the principal one is that there was this idea sort of in the ether when I first started reading about this, that Rogers personally was determined from the outset to make it a kind of whitewash, that he'd been charged with he'd been charged by Reagan with preserving NASA's reputation and not going too deep, and it being a kind of public relations exercise. We're going to have an investigation, but everything's going to turn out all right. Slap some wrists and let's move on. But one of the people I interviewed, who was one of the last surviving members of the people that served on the commission, who was the executive director, Ambassador Alton Keel, and he had a lot of very interesting things to say about Rogers' attitude and the aims of the commission. And what he made clear was that Keel and Rogers were both determined from the outset to make sure that NASA was not destroyed by the investigation. But they wanted to find out what had gone wrong. They wanted to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. But they just wanted to make sure that as could easily have happened, the agency as a whole was just not completely annihilated by the findings of the reports. And that I thought was pretty interesting, because as I say, it was easy just reading superficially initially to get the idea that Rogers really did, he was sort of led in the direction that the commission ultimately went in, the findings of which were utterly damning, by the evidence, and sort of in some way sort of reluctantly, but that was not at all what happened. And so I found that kind of fascinating. But also the other thing that emerged was that Rogers was really infuriated by the way in which it seemed to him that senior NASA officials had deliberately led him astray and dissembled deliberately when they were on the stand in front of the public in the private hearings. The extent of that really surprised me. So I think that those were the two things that most surprised me about it. The level of kind of behind the scenes drama, in short, I found fascinating.
Which really is a climax to your whole story, going to those earlier decades of NASA's history about the tension between resiliency and accountability, and that compromise that seems to be always at the heart of NASA about the need for public engagement.
Mm-hmm.
One of the last things I want to ask you before we get into our final section, which we call kind of hints for history, in which you give us a little thought on what are the best sources you use for your book, or what are the things other people should look into. We have private citizens going into space on the shuttle program with Challenger.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to mark an inflection point in American space history, about space no longer being the preserve of, say, government-funded exploration, but maybe the preserve of private enterprise and a kind of frontier for every American, or every citizen of the world in a kind of broader, inspirational way. At the same time, what we see today is commercial space flight is not yet here, and those private citizens who do go into space are extraordinarily wealthy. And so do you see this point in American space history as an inflection point on that kind of movement away from the days of the Mercury 7 and the Apollo astronauts who were, Navy test pilots and really military men, to the point we are now, where space seems somehow more attainable for those outside of that kind of elite group?
Well, I think there's two different ways of looking at this, because it's certainly, you're absolutely right. It definitely was an inflection point, but the first is that the whole principle upon which the space shuttle program was founded was that it was going to make it was going to make spaceflight routine. So the whole idea of the space shuttle was that it was visualized as something that would fly into space with the ease and frequency of a jet airliner. That, in the initial forecasts, NASA told Congress that it was going to be launching more than once a week. And so, what went with that ultimately, and this is where the spaceflight participant program that brought us the Teacher in Space, this is where this was going, was really a genuine democratization of space. The idea was that they were going to be sending ordinary civilians who were just given minimal, a few months training. They were going to be going into space with some regularity. And the Challenger accident, brought that to a halt very quickly. Surprisingly, not immediately, because the second group of candidates for the spaceflight participant program were going to be journalists. And those people had already put their names forward, and the initial selections had started by the time Challenger took off in January 1986. But even after the accident happened, they didn't immediately curtail that. And the selection process, with a lot of enthusiastic journalists involved, that continued for several months after the accident happened. But eventually, the notion of the space flight participant program was wound up. And with that, the Western notion, certainly, of the democratization of space evaporated. So, yes, now we have citizens in space, but they're all worth, north of like $10 billion. And it is, as you mentioned to me before we started, essentially a playground for the super wealthy. And there's no redeeming social value whatever in that. William Shatner going up and telling us how wonderful Earth looks from space. Is that really valuable to humanity? Probably not.
And you'd probably have to sell quite a few copies of this book to reach the minimum net worth threshold to get up in space yourself.
And
So
also, I don't think my wife would let me take that kind of risk. But the other way in which it's a key inflection point in what you're talking about is that the one of the ways in which the shuttle, fitted in with Reagan's economic plans so snugly was that it was designed to turn a profit, and that what they embarked on was a program to take payments from private commercial enterprises to put satellites into orbit, and this was the principal way in which it was supposed to pay for itself ultimately. And this idea of using this government organization as a commercial space trucking service, reached its apogee where there were discussions of selling one of the 4 shuttle orbiters that they had in service at the time to Federal Express. I mean, that's how neatly this was going to dovetail. But one of the consequences of the Challenger accident was that very swiftly afterwards, the Reagan White House wound up this idea of carrying commercial payloads into space. So after the Challenger accident, they just said, we're not going to do that anymore. So they surrendered that whole area. And Reagan explicitly referred to this when he announced this, was that was going to be taken over by private industry. So that's really that's the starting point for, the kind of commercial rocketry that you see now with SpaceX and these other companies being paid to carry commercial property into space.
And you do a good job, before we get to the end of the section, I think it's important to note, of putting in the broader global economic context in space, right? So you have in 1979, you have the European Space Agency starting to do their own launches, depriving the U.S. of a source of income for its own space program. Mm-hmm. And so that raises the kind of market of competition, certainly in the Western economic sphere, for the shuttle program. So I think I just wanted to point that out really quickly, because it was something I was looking for in your book, and I found it. And
good.
And sometimes it's good to find the things you're looking for. Adam, the thing we like to do, as I pointed out on these episodes, is hints for history. What source do you think could be kind of tapped further? Source that you used for this book, for other people writing on let's say space history or related disciplines or related issues and topics. And I don't want you to give away your next book. If you were talking to another author who wanted to write something on the history of space, what would you say is an area that could use a little more examination?
Oh, and I feel like, I don't want to misrepresent myself as a historian of space, because I started cold with this. I mean, I'd written magazine features about spaceflight and stuff in the past, but I had to I started from zero learning about this to write this book. I mean, the one source that I found absolutely amazing when I began work on this project was the records of the Rogers Commission that are held at the National Archives in College Park. And one of the reasons for that is that when Rogers started the commission up, he determined that they were going to learn the long-term lessons of the Warren Commission, because the records of the Warren Commission were kept secret. All of their investigative records and all of that stuff that they gathered while they were investigating the assassination. And of course, by 1986, they realized that this was just absolutely the fantastic ground in which conspiracy theories could develop. So Rogers determined that as soon as they concluded the investigation and the report was published, every scrap of paper that they had gathered, every recording, everything that the investigators generated during the course of their investigation would be made public, and they were committed to total transparency. So all of this stuff that they found that they discovered, that they recorded, is held at the National Archives. And the material I used just barely scratches the surface of this stuff. Because one of the things I used was that one of the tools of the investigation was to send out these investigators, one of whom was an FBI agent, one of whom was from the National Transportation Safety Board. And they did all of these interviews with everyone involved with the launch decision process, going back years. And the transcripts of all of those interviews, with some exceptions that are still withheld for various different, government secrecy reasons, all of that stuff is in the National Archives, and that just was a gold mine of information of people's almost immediate, because these interviews were conducted within 2 or 3 months of the accident happening. Their recollections of specific conversations. It records what the atmosphere in meeting rooms was, exactly what people said. It was just amazing. And so, and as I say, that's just one fraction of the material that was gathered by the Rogers Commission.
Well, I know you say you're not a historian, but historians generally kind of get very excited about archives, and you seem to fit that bill.
Oh no, I can't deny that I'm pathetically excited. Rarely more excited than when walking into a kind of windowless room filled with file boxes that clearly nobody has disturbed for decades.
Well, it takes a special person, and you seem to be sounding more and more like a historian every minute. Well, Adam, thanks so much for this podcast. Again, to our listeners, the book is Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space, out May 14th, I believe it is.
That's right.
And go pick it up wherever you pick up your books. Adam will be making the rounds, signing books, I'm assuming, across country, hopefully here in Washington, D.C. in the near future. Adam, thanks again.
Thank you.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.